Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Jonnychipz in Conversation With. If you're watching on Azure Live, hello. Hope you're taking part in the chat below. Any questions or comments, please feed them back through. If you're watching on a replay on the YouTube channel, hello again, but thanks for tuning into the YouTube. So this episode, today I'm joined by a fast track engineer who's currently working with Microsoft. He's a vlogger, he's a blogger, he's a community organizer. On that note, today my guest on In Conversation With is Chris Reddington. So, hi Chris, thanks so much for joining me. How are you doing?
Hey John, I'm good, thanks. Thank you for having me. How are you?
No, not at all. Yeah, I'm doing well, I think that was the first time I ever did that in first take, so I'm quite happy with it.
I was very impressed. I know we were just talking right before we went on about fluffing up all the lines, and it's very easy. Hopefully we'll get through it.
I think the blooper reel is in order. I think we'll save them up for the end of year blooper reel. We'll do a special one-off thing, eh?
Sounds good.
So, Chris, thanks so much for joining me tonight. It's great to have you on. Obviously, we've been in touch, over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months, something like that now on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's great to see your content that you're putting out into the community, and you're a fellow Welshie. So I think, us Welshies got to stick together.
Cymru ambith, absolutely.
Well, indeed. So, I mean, on that note, Chris, obviously, for those that are watching now, I don't know if you just want to give yourself a little bit of an introduction, tell us where you're working, what you're up to, and what's going on in your life at the minute.
Yeah, sure. So, Chris Reddington, as you said in the intro, I'm a fast track engineer at Microsoft. So I've been on this team for the past 4 years or so. I've been at Microsoft for about 7 now, which is really scary because that time has flown by. And throughout that time, I've been focused on all things cloud. The last kind of 6 or so have really been Azure. And I focus mainly on the app dev space. So day to day, what I do in the fast track team, I'm sure we'll explore a little bit later. But I focus really on DevOps, on things like the PaaS services, Kubernetes, and then of course have some of the community work to fall back on as well. So maybe that's a bit of insight we can draw into later as well there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's cool because I think sometimes when I start speaking with people on these shows, I kind of pick the people that I see and inspire me through the community. And you are one of those guys, Chris, that the work that you're doing at the moment and the content that you're putting together is fantastic. So I mean, maybe if we start with your current day job and just to pick you up on your current role. So you're an engineer working for Fast Track. I mean, for those that are watching that might not know what Fast Track is all about, do you mind giving us all a little bit of a brief summary of what that entails?
Yeah, sure, no worries. So Fast Track for Azure, we are a team inside of Microsoft and we're part of Azure Engineering, so Azure Customer Experience. And day to day, what we're there to do is help onboard customers onto the platform. So if you think about a customer who's working on some project, they want to go and take it to production, they might not have necessarily all of the skills that they need to get that project successfully into production. So we're not like a replacement for partners, we're not a replacement for consulting or anything like that, but we're that engineering voice, that voice of Microsoft coming along and giving some guidance as part of that project. So, whether they need to play off some thoughts around the architectural design or whether they need some guidance around how to use Kubernetes or particularly AKS, of course, in that instance, helping enable that project to get to production, really. So we're not there to give kind of general teaching and general guidance or that type of thing. It's really about taking a specific project into production. So because we're a program funded by Microsoft, there is, of course, some caveats around things like, how big the project is, whether you've got all the buy-in and the stakeholders and everything, etc. And really whether it's ready to go. And I mean, if it's ready to go, then it's probably worth speaking with your Microsoft account teams or nominating through the public pages as well, which maybe I can bring up on screen on a sec here for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, the Fast Track team, like you said then, Chris, so they are a resource that's funded by Microsoft that really want to focus on those customers who know where they need to go or where they want to go, but maybe just want to bounce a few ideas off, get a little bit of a technical rubber stamp from Microsoft. Is that the kind of service that Fast Track offers?
Kind of. So we won't rubber stamp, and I'm not sure whether even anywhere in Microsoft there's like the rubber stamping.
Yeah.
But we're really there to say, actually, we've seen in other customers, for example, these kind of scenarios. Have you thought about X? Have you thought about Y? Have you thought about Z? Or in the recommended practices, these are maybe some of the patterns. These are some of the approaches that are recommended. We don't see these in here. Is there a reason for that? And we try and drive it a lot around requirements, right? And it's something that's very prominent in some of my blogging and my podcasting, the importance of requirements, because the example I always give is, you could always have the most theoretically scalable, resilient, awesome platform you could ever build, but that might take 5 years to go and build, and then you find out 5 years later that actually, hey, you didn't need that at all. You just needed that quick and easy thing you could have made in about 2 months, where it doesn't need to be resilient. It doesn't need to be as scalable to the nth degree. So understanding what you're building and having that context is where the team then can come in and give that guidance around, okay, you need 99.999% availability, but you're deploying in one region. What happens if that region goes down, or there's a service outage or something like that? And being able to have some of those discussions then.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you touched on it then, Chris. So, I mean, in terms of architectural patterns and the way that that we should all be kind of putting together these architectural designs and prototypes, or whatever the solution is that you might be, I've seen in some of your blogs that you've touched on a few of these. Have you got any to hand that you just want to kind of give us a little bit of a summary of, that we should kind of maybe look into a bit more to kind of give us a bit of a head start, so to speak?
Sure. So it's probably worth prefacing. Maybe I'll just give a quick soundbite about the blog and the podcast first, just for anyone who's not following. So cloudwithchris.com, it's my personal blog, so it's not like a Microsoft associated thing or anything like that. This is some of the things that I've picked up and just wanting to share back into the community. And one of the things that has really struck me over time, and the reason I started this, actually, if I show you, we can go down memory lane a bit here.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
If I scroll all the way back, because I ported over some of my blogs from way back when, I wrote this blog back in 2016 about building solutions in the cloud, and talk about some of these things we were just talking about. What happens if there's a data center outage? What happens
sorry, Chris, do you want to zoom in just a little bit?
Of course.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's cool. Yeah,
that's better, isn't it? So yeah, talking about some of those points that we were just mentioning there. And when I was looking back at this blog, which I completely neglected, hadn't posted a lot in a while, I was thinking, maybe actually there's something that I could do here. Maybe this is something that I can help out with. And that's really where reviving that, working on cloudwithchris.com came about. And looking at starting up various series of content, one of which is this series called Architecting for the Cloud, One Pattern at a Time. So what I do in these sessions is I invite different guests who have different domain expertise. They come on and we talk all about various cloud design patterns. And all of these design patterns are available publicly. They're available in the Azure Architecture Center. And we can take a look at that in a sec as well. But there's tons of these different patterns. And I think the interesting thing is, I think a lot of people don't really realize that they're there and they exist. And, they're well proven. And some of them aren't necessarily brand new either. There are some, for example, let's have a look down here. Let's go to maybe the first page where we start looking at some of the more common patterns. Throttling, retry, and circuit breaker, for example. I would say they're quite fundamental patterns, where if you think about throttling often has this negative connotation with it, that I'm being throttled, it's a bad thing. But actually, when you think about what throttling is, it's their designs to protect the system. So it's stopping the system being overwhelmed. So things like that, things like retry, if I send a request, for example, to an API or a database or something like that, and it's not there for some reason, maybe there's a service outage, or maybe, like a lot of scenarios happen in the cloud, it's all internet-based routing rather than the reliable routing that we have in our on-premises data centers. There might be a blip with the routing, and it just doesn't arrive for some reason. Or it doesn't look like the database is there, for example. If we retry that, then absolutely fine. We'll get it the second time round. And then circuit breaker relates to that as well. A bit like, I know you've been doing a lot of building as well, and electronics and everything. So the analogy's there. Circuit breaker, if the system's going to get overwhelmed, cut it off. Otherwise, start gradually then allowing it to come back through. Slight difference to how electronics work, but the analogy is still there.
No, absolutely great. I mean, it's great to hear, because obviously when you're talking about these design and these architectural patterns and ways that you could develop and design a solution in the cloud, I've spoken with previous guests about this kind of concept of, just because it's a cloud and just because we're all used to, maybe spinning up a virtual machine in our hypervisor of choice, we shouldn't necessarily just jump feet first into the cloud and use it in the same way. There are lots of things that you can do to change your way of thinking now when it comes to solution design. And I guess, Chris, that's what these architectural patterns are kind of trying to underpin and show. Look, if you are going to go down this road or that road, think about these kind of things. Is that pretty much what we're talking about, Chris? Yeah,
and I think bringing it back to the requirements discussion as well, I think those are the two pieces that then come together is, what is it you're actually trying to do? What's the context? So are you a healthcare provider? Are you a retailer? Are you I don't know, whatever industry you're in, right? What are some of those compliance things that you might need to worry about so you can only stay in certain regions? What availability do you need? And then what patterns help you go and meet some of those requirements? And that's when you can then start looking at maybe some of the technology pieces, because I know myself, for example, and a few of my colleagues, we're all technologists, we're all engineers, right? We love to solve problems, feet first, and get stuck in. But sometimes you just need to take that slight edge back and think, right, okay, what's the problem here? What are we trying to solve? Because it's very easy with this being so many choices to go down a path that might not be an appropriate path. So just having that context and level setting is important there.
You're right, Chris. Like you say, you've got to really bring all of this back to your requirements definition, your discovery. What is the problem that you're trying to solve for your particular business issue? And you kind of throw all that into a big mixing pot, I suppose, and then you come out with some kind of a way forward. And like you alluded to earlier, it could mean the difference between a quick and dirty minimum viable product, so something you can spin up in relatively short amount of time to get you to your version 1.0 sort of platform. Or it could be that you spend the length of time that you need to develop the solution. It may take a little bit longer, and I guess it's that typical consultative answer, isn't it? That it kind of depends on where you're going. But it's great to see that these kind of architects, like I've dipped, as an architect myself, I've dipped into the Microsoft Architecture Center on occasion. But like you say, they're all publicly available, and they may be bedtime reading some of these articles, but it's not there to be read from cover to cover. It's there to kind of offer assistance for a particular thing that you or your business may be looking at the time, I guess, Chris.
Absolutely. And to pick up on something that you said there as well about the minimum viable product, and it might take a bit longer. I think the other thing as well is important to understand that requirements aren't necessarily fixed either. So you might say, for example, day one, we need to be able to serve 1,000 users, for example. But over time, hopefully you want the business to grow and you want the solution to grow as well. So, having flexibility in those requirements is important. And that's where I think some of these patterns can help with that growth as well, making sure that you're not adopting anti-patterns that could block you from doing that, right? So I think that's the double-edged sword of this, is making sure that you're setting yourself up for success and that you have that flexibility to change for the future as well.
And that's a great call out, Chris. And, because I've seen so many customers where they've absolutely taken that approach where they thought, okay, great, we've got Azure, we've got cloud, we've got a subscription. We know we just need to put that application in there, which may not be optimized for cloud. It may be a traditional, sort of big installation on a couple of VMs with a load balancer, which is great. They may go full in. There we go. I've just spun up that application. But what have they achieved in that sense? And don't get me wrong, there's absolutely a time and a place that you may want to do that. But if you just take that, take that moment to understand what the art of the possible is, I guess, with cloud and cloud principles, you can set yourself up for, as you just suggested, Chris, which is that growth. And, you use the term flexibility. I mean, some may even use the term agile, and, that agile engineering and that agile movement that we find ourselves in more and more as techies. I mean, do you see it like that, Chris, at the moment? Are you speaking with customers that are very much on those kind of roadmaps or journeys?
Yeah, I think so. I see a complete mix. I see some, for example, where you just mentioned there, John, around let's just get the application up into the cloud, and that's kind of stage one. For example, I've seen some which are taking super legacy systems and just getting them into virtual machines, and that's can be its own challenge, right? Because of the nature of cloud, and as I mentioned earlier, just how it's different to on-premises because it's built on the internet, right? The internet is not necessarily reliable sometimes, so you need to figure out how you kind of bridge those gaps. But then once you start going through the next hoop of, okay, let's start making this a little more cloud native. Let's start designing for that resilience that we know things are going to go wrong. Let's make sure that we actually start protecting against some of those in the application and taking some of those patterns. It's absolutely a journey. You don't need to solve it all in one go, but just make sure you understand why you're going on that journey. Because if you're just, as an example, going to the cloud and you hear about this shiny Kubernetes thing and you think, right, we're going to take this legacy application and just drop it straight into Kubernetes, that might not go the best for you because, have you taken the time to understand how Kubernetes works and the nuances of it compared to running in virtual machines, for example? Because, for example, if you start scaling out, whether that goes for PaaS services or Kubernetes or whatever, and you've got state on certain machines, when you scale back in, what is that user experience then once those machines disappear or those instances disappear? So there can be challenges, and it's important that you understand the context of your application again there. I feel like I'm banging the drum on this one quite a lot, but yeah.
Not at all, Chris. I mean, as a, if we, let's talk a little bit about Kubernetes at the moment, because it's such a hot topic at the moment. There seems to be such a lot of conversation in the community. With businesses, I'm starting to see now customers actually actively asking, from questions like, what is this Kubernetes thing, all the way through to, can you come on and redefine our application into a microservices-based platform? Which, those two kind of asks are complete polar opposite ends of the spectrum. So, I mean, I'm going to be modest because I don't know a huge amount about Kubernetes other than enough to be dangerous, I think is the best phrase. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to Kubernetes, Chris, are you seeing that now more often with customers? Are they asking you those kinds of questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think where I start the conversation, to be honest, with someone who I feel is new to the cloud as well, the first question I ask is, why are you considering Kubernetes? It's that kind of open-ended question where you let them chart their path and see where it ends up. And there can be some varieties of that. And I think some of the common answers I've had, for example, are those scenarios of, our CTO saw about it, or someone senior saw it, and they thought it was the new technology, they need to start adopting it. And I understand the need to kind of keep modern and making sure you're using modern platforms. But if that's the only reason, sometimes I've seen that it's a little bit overkill or a little bit over-engineering, thinking back again to those requirements for the context of what you're trying to work on. Like, if you're just hosting a single website on a Kubernetes platform, that's probably overkill when you could have used something like App Service, which is a lot simpler, assuming it met the requirements. Because there's a lot of complexity that comes with Kubernetes. And, I've been using Kubernetes for a few years, and I still wouldn't consider myself an expert necessarily in all things. I think you can really go down a rabbit hole with it. Like, you can start looking at things like observability and network monitoring and all these things. And I think the important point to understand with something like AKS, if you've never built a Kubernetes cluster, it's worth going through the Kubernetes the hard way course. It's something that I think Kelsey Hightower wrote, and there are various examples of that online. There's an Azure version that someone put together as well, and doing that on virtual machines and building a Kubernetes cluster from scratch. I think that's where something like AKS really brings value, because you don't have to bootstrap that entire cluster from scratch, but it's not a PaaS platform per se. I think some of the newer features are making it more and more like a PaaS platform, but there's still a ton of management that you need to do, especially on the cluster. Your role-based access control, your pod definitions, deployments, and how you bring all of that together. So you still have a lot of management. It's just shifted slightly higher up the stack, I would say.
I'm with you. No, I mean, when it comes to Kubernetes, I think the first time I kind of dipped my toe in the water, so to speak, was, off the back of AKS, or, obviously Azure Kubernetes services, which, as you suggested, gives that kind of PaaS management plane bit, that control plane, isn't it? Is my understanding, that then manages essentially this bunch of infrastructure. So this bunch of VMs that you may have in a cluster that you then run all of your container services on. And so, I mean, I've had a few customers now talk to me about Kubernetes, and the way that I've kind of explained it to them is around, look, if you're really developing an application from the ground up, then it kind of makes sense to start looking at that architecture. But if you're trying to transform a third-party application, then you're probably best off just running with a bunch of VMs, or maybe even look to break some things out into serverless functions or whatever it may be. But I mean, I suppose that the nuts and bolts, Chris, I don't know if you see it the same, but there seems to be a lot of stuff in our kit bag as IT pros, as customers. There's lots of things that we could go and do, and there's a lot of overlap between those things and tools that you can use. Do you see that the same way when it comes to Kubernetes? Is it the kind of product that you're kind of running with customers when they're starting off like a cloud native application, they're looking to define it, or are you looking to re-engineer current applications into those kind of services? What are you seeing at the moment, Chris? Yeah,
good question. So I've probably seen all three of those scenarios. I've seen the example I gave earlier around the legacy application wanting to take that straight to Kubernetes, and had to have a very, how do I word this, maybe political discussion, let's say, about not going down that path. But then they quickly realized actually it was for the better. They don't go down that path yet, and first go infra-based. Then we had another set of scenarios around customers that are already using things like app services wanting to standardize on something like Kubernetes, because they're running at such a scale of applications that actually they can consolidate on costs, and they can simplify their deployment by going onto Kubernetes. So whilst I said earlier it can be more complicated going Kubernetes, it can also be simpler going. And then I've seen as well people who want to go and build completely cloud native. They don't want to have a dependency on Azure infrastructure. They want to depend on Kubernetes, so that they could go and deploy on premises, on Google, on AWS, on Azure, and go and deploy on any platform that they want. So seeing the mix.
I think we probably should have prefaced that part of our conversation with a caveat saying, these are our opinions. There's no right or wrong way at all about it. And I suppose to kind of try and roll it back a little bit, I mean, what would your message be to kind of those IT pros, those techie guys or gals that are, they're working a 9 to 5 at the moment. They're hearing all this wonderful stuff about AKS, Kubernetes, K8s, containers. What would you suggest would be their first method? I know you said that there was like a crash course or something they could go on, and that YouTube is a great source of information. But what kind of person do you think would benefit from understanding containers and Kubernetes most? Do you think? I mean, that's probably quite a big question, but I mean, I just keen to get your take on it from an industry perspective, I suppose.
So I think if you don't understand containers first, definitely start there before you start looking into Kubernetes. You need to understand containers, because really the idea behind a container is to kind of standardize your unit of deployment. You have an image, you deploy that out. And then Kubernetes builds upon that because it's managing containers at scale. That's the whole idea behind Kubernetes. And for all of your listeners, I'm going to drop a huge secret and a huge tip. Kubernetes is just a big desired state machine, right? You say how many containers you want to go and run. Kubernetes inside its brain just figures out, okay, I've got 2 containers, I need 5, I need to spin up 3 more. Oh, one's dropped off, I now need to spin up another one. And that is all Kubernetes is doing. So if you've got a scenario where you want to have this kind of self-healing system where it's able to go and manage the scale, etc., for you on your behalf, then that's maybe something where you'd want to explore Kubernetes. And it's relevant for whether you're a developer, whether you're an infrastructure person, because you're probably seeing, or at least I'm seeing, a lot of people start moving from virtual machines to containers because you get more density, you get the quicker startup times, for example. And when you think about the quicker startup times, when you think of those scale out scenarios, then it's good for that because more containers come online very quickly. You don't need to wait for virtual machines to come online and boot up. So it does have a number of benefits. Then from a developer perspective, you need to understand the kind of build process around that. You're not necessarily managing the underlying infrastructure, but how do you deploy to Kubernetes, or how do you build a Docker image, or whatever container runtime that you're using, for example. So there's different angles that you'd go and look at that. I think maybe if we just switch over again, actually, if that's all right, John.
Yeah, absolutely.
In case anyone's not aware of this already, Microsoft Learn has been around for, I think, a couple of years now. And this has a whole load of different learning paths and different courses and modules and whatnot available here. And what it's probably worth just looking at, if we just, I don't know, maybe jump into a random course here and just click browse. What you'll be able to do here is just filter down on what products you're interested in, and maybe we care about, for example, there's my search, AKS. Now you can see on here, there's some learning paths, for example, on how I develop and deploy applications on AKS, how I can go and manage app configuration, optimizing compute costs, for example. So depending on my scenario, there might be something in here for me. So, we've been talking AKS there, but if we talk like, fundamentals of cloud, for example, or fundamentals of Azure, there's things in there. So if you're just getting started on that journey and you've been listening thinking, I've got no idea what containers are or Kubernetes, I just want to start learning what Azure is, then there's that level of content there as well. So Microsoft Learn's a really great resource there if you're getting started on that path as well.
No, absolutely, Chris. I think I'm a huge champion of Microsoft Learn myself. I think it's just great how much investment Microsoft have put into that platform, especially since sort of the lockdown scenario, since probably a good year or so now. I mean, the content is just phenomenal. I think even now they're releasing new courses and new examinations that we can take. They've already got that kind of learning path on that website, haven't they? And it's a fantastic, like you say, it's a fantastic place to go if you've got any question. And you're right. I mean, it's fair to say, and that's part of why I enjoy speaking with people like yourself, Chris, because I think sometimes we're too quick to come at it from a point of we forget all of the stuff and all the journey we've individually taken to get to the point of where we've got this knowledge in our heads. And sometimes we can start throwing out acronyms and ways of working, and to somebody else, being that person myself, it can sometimes turn people away because that whole imposter syndrome, you don't feel worthy of knowing. But it's really not like that. I mean, how has your learning journey been for yourself, Chris, over the last few years? Obviously you've been with Microsoft, like you say, for 7 or 8 years now, and you're moving role. Maybe we'll touch upon that in a second.
Yes.
What's that learning journey been like for yourself, Chris, and kind of how have you tackled it, I guess?
So number one, you mentioned imposter syndrome, and I want to say, just because I work at Microsoft, right, doesn't mean I don't get imposter syndrome. I absolutely get that as well. Loads of my colleagues do. It's, I think, just a thing in the industry, and I'm sure I read a tweet or a blog post or even a video from Scott Hanselman where he was talking about the same as well. And for both of us, right, Scott Hanselman is another person in the community who you look at and just think is absolutely amazing. Yeah, and absolutely. To hear that someone like that also gets that is just really enlightening, I thought. But coming to the question on learning, it's going to sound cliche, but honestly, I'm always learning. Like I mentioned, there are areas where I'm an expert at. There are areas where I'm good enough at, and there are areas where, like you said earlier, I know enough to be dangerous. I think the important bit is knowing where you are in those different areas on the different technologies. So for me, for example, Kubernetes, some of the PaaS services, Azure DevOps, GitHub, they're my strong points. As I start getting into like SQL and things like that, I back off. I know that I know enough there, but not enough to kind of go to the nuts and bolts of the system. So for me, I'm someone who's quite measured, I guess, in the way that I approach things. So I take all the exams. I've been doing a load of the Azure exams over the past few years just to make sure I'm keeping current. And I use Microsoft Learn, for example, to go and prep for some of those as well.
I mean, the kind of reason that I asked that question is, I don't know about you, Chris, but what I find at the moment, maybe it's the role that I do, for my job, but I'm speaking with customers on that broad spectrum. So knowing enough about as many things as possible is great. But you kind of, and again, I've spoken with other guests about this, you become what's known as like a jack of all trades, a master of none. So I guess it's that question of, especially I guess as somebody new coming into the industry, where do they focus their efforts? Where is it, where is the most value going to be? And I guess maybe it's down to the company they're working for, what their interests are, what they want to do as a hobby outside of work. But for me, it's always been that, well, as soon as I do something in that area, I mean, DevOps is a prime area because from my perspective, the moment you start looking at DevOps and infrastructure as code and coding, not only is there a raft of things that you have to learn, but you touch on areas that you think, oh, are they in my jurisdiction here, or do I now need to become a SQL engineer, for example? So, I mean, do you see it the same way, Chris, in terms that the roles and the traditional roles, I guess, are blurred a lot, and do you, how do you tackle those kind of conundrums, I guess, when you hit them for yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the DevOps one is a really good example to draw on. Actually, I think you gave the example of infrastructure as code. So, infrastructure as code. It's code, right? So does it sit with the dev or does it sit with the ops people? That's a common debate that I see. Another great example is with the database folks. So, commonly you will have seen people manually manage their databases, but now you're seeing a lot of people want to go and do data DevOps, where they do schema-driven designs, they source control all of their schemas, and then any migrations need to go and be done through code. So it's very clear what one state is going to the next. It goes through some checks, but whose responsibility is that? Is that the data engineers? Is that the developers? And I think what I see, to answer your question, is not necessarily the roles are getting grayer. I think there's overlap in terms of the roles, and the skills that you need are getting grayer. So, a DBA, for example, will need to start knowing how to do version control and how to do builds and things like that, because they'll still want to own, for example, their databases and whatnot. It's just the way that they may approach those is slightly different. Rather than doing everything manually, click through whatever tools they're used to, maybe now they'll do it through some kind of pipeline, because the scale of the systems they're running are now 24/7. They can't afford that time window, for example, that they had for maintenance. So now they need to go and automate some of these things. So I think what you're going to see is maybe the skills that people need are a little more stretched. These cross-cutting concerns like DevOps and monitoring, I think they're going to be teams, for example, that, well, in fact, it is really DevOps, isn't it? You own what you build what you own, and you control your own destiny. And I think that's what you'll start seeing a bit more of, is that extending of skills rather than necessarily reshaping the roles. But it does create this grayness for sure. I completely see that.
Yeah, and I think, I think I'm sensing from the way you've answered that as well, you're very much in the same area as me, where, again, I think we're just in this zone at the moment, in the industry, I guess, where I think it's probably fair to say, obviously, DevOps as a term is misunderstood a lot of the time, is probably not an unfair thing to say, but not going down that rabbit hole of conversation. If we were to look at it purely from a technical perspective, so in other words, what does DevOps, and in the Azure space, we've got this product called Azure Devops, which then confuses the issue even more. But let's just say that we're going to narrow down our understanding of DevOps to a tool set like Azure Devops. And you alluded to the fact there, Chris, like all of a sudden now, a DBA may have to start checking in code into maybe a Git repository, and maybe using pipelines to build, something when they change a schema on a database. I have no doubt that to a lot of DBAs, if you're a DBA watching this now, you're probably, generally speaking, again, going, what is a pipeline? what is Git? And I know we haven't scripted this talk, Chris, but I mean, do you, in your own mind, have a kind of baseline to the minimum number of skills that you should need when you're kind of approaching this whole DevOps mentality? And again, let's keep this technical, from a technical perspective, if just to kind of contain the conversation as best we can.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I think number one, everyone would need to understand version control. There was a thread going on Twitter recently, I think you may have been in it as well, I can't remember, where people were talking about projects they've been involved with, obscured of course, but talking about some of the things they've seen and how few people are seeing version control actually as part of their projects. And that worries me a little bit, because how do you roll back to a known state of the system if you don't have that version state? And that's not just for infrastructure or the source code, right? That's, as we've mentioned, the schema of the database and everything like that. I think that's kind of table stakes, really, in terms of getting into the DevOps side of things, is being able to look at your state over time, just for your own productivity. Like, I've been working on a V2 of my website for my podcast. If I didn't have version control, I would have been stuffed so many times, because I need to roll back. I need to go and look at why I made a change or why I implemented something. That's just something that I'm used to day to day now. And Git does sound a bit scary sometimes when you start talking version control, branching, etc. But to be quite honest, the majority of people don't need to understand the whole complexity behind Git. As long as you've got something like VS Code or Visual Studio and you understand some of the basic concepts, you're probably good to go with it.
That is great to hear. I mean, in my mind, I've been thinking for such a long time now, like even for colleagues, people I work with, you need to learn Git. You need to learn Git because it's going to become a staple, probably fair to say, of every techie's job at some stage. Don't get me wrong, there's obviously going to be caveats, and obviously this is our opinion now talking, but do you see the same things, Chris, in terms of Git being one of those skills that, like you just said there, either VS Code or even command line based, if you want to go down that road, just installing Git onto your machine and having a play with it just to show? And you brought Scott Hanselman up earlier, and this was mentioned on the previous video, but he has done some cracking, what is Git videos. So, go and look those up, because they explain things so well, in my opinion, kind of, put the context around, you can have version control, but, what is the product called, or what is the tool called that we might want to use to do that version control? And in this conversation, we're talking about Git, So, anything else over and above that? I mean, well, no, let's stay on Git for a minute, because I know there's so much that Git does. And
yeah, sure.
When we talk about Git in the concepts of there's Git and GitHub, we've got GitLab.
Yes.
There are lots of different products out there, is probably first and fair to say, isn't there? And one of the things that I see a lot, let's just bring it back to a little bit of a Microsoft focus, but when we talk GitHub, there's a lot of talk over the last few months or so about, you've got Azure Devops, and within Azure Devops you've got this thing called repos, which is fundamentally doing the same version controlling as something like GitHub does and offers. How are you seeing those conversations at the moment? And of course, I'm not asking you to do any NDA stuff that you may or may not know. But where's your views on the differences between GitHub and Azure DevOps repos? Where do you see that at the moment, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So let's just start off for anyone who is listening and thinking, hold on, Git, GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps, whoa. So I like analogies. So imagine Git as like a vacuum cleaner, and vacuum cleaner is generic, right? So Git is your version control. It's where you kind of store your code, and as the name implies, you can have different versions.
Hopefully not in a vacuum cleaner, though, Chris. Yeah,
hopefully not in a vacuum cleaner. Yeah, if you've stored it there, we've got problems.
Yeah, but I'm with you. Go on.
But then GitHub might be like a Dyson. Git Lab might be a Henry Hoover, and they're kind of different brands or different platforms that kind of implement that vacuum cleaner standard, let's say. I'm stretching the analogy a bit here, but I'm thinking
I'm
on
following.
my feet.
I'm with you.
So they're all kind of different platforms or different brands then that you could go and host your Git repositories on. So Azure Devops, for example, is a service managed and run by Microsoft. And GitHub is a company and also a platform that Microsoft bought 2 years ago, I want to say now.
Yeah.
I think it was about 2 years ago. Hence your question. And, you know, I think I've been seeing it a lot as well. And when you think about it, Azure DevOps isn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon, because if you've listened to people like Abel Wang, Donovan Brown, they've talked plenty of times about the Microsoft DevOps story, and at the center of that is Azure DevOps. You know, it's that all of the various platforms, for example, or so many different platforms within Microsoft are going to be hosted and run using Azure DevOps and deployed using Azure DevOps. And there's actually a great series online. I think it's actually called the Azure Devops. I'll do a search for it while we're talking. Make sure we can share the link.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
There's just so many ways that you can kind of look at that. So Azure DevOps, for example, is hosting Azure repos, Azure boards, Azure pipelines, Azure artifacts. GitHub has GitHub repos, has GitHub Actions, has GitHub Package Registry, has very similar services. So ultimately, I think what you need to do, going back to requirements, is take a look at what makes sense for you. Because I think it's no surprise that GitHub is going to be the strategic Microsoft investment moving forward, but it doesn't mean that Azure DevOps is going away anywhere or, you know, disappearing at all, because there's still things that GitHub doesn't do today that Azure DevOps does. We were talking last week on Azure After Dark, actually, about this, that GitHub, for example, doesn't have as granular permissions control, for example, as Azure DevOps does. And for any organization that needs to have super fine-grained controls, it might not quite meet the requirements just yet. Or if you're like we are, based in Europe, there isn't a GitHub instance for Europe, for example. So, you know, there's some of those data sovereignty requirements to think about as well. So I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis. You need to go and evaluate what makes sense. And I think, you know, the guidance out there is pretty good and pretty clear at the moment around that. I think what you'll see over time is you'll start seeing the two of them play well together. And, you know, you've probably seen over the past 12, 18 months that Azure DevOps has been investing in that kind of GitHub bridging the gap with GitHub issues, being able to visualize those and link between Azure boards, for example, being able to use GitHub repositories, being able to use GitHub Actions with Azure repos, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there's a number of different integration points there. So I think it really depends on the scenario.
No, absolutely. And that's great insights, to be honest, Chris. I think the way you described that then is kind of, I suppose, from when you scale it back again, if you're coming into this industry now and you start to look at these things, right, I've got to learn this new skill called Git. And you look around and there's lots of Gits, you know, to use your Hoover analogy, you might have that Henry Hoover and you might have been running it in your business for as long as, you know, the last 2 or 3 years. If it's working for you, brilliant. You know, you've got no reason to change. But, you know, GitHub may have that little attachment that, you know, you may be able to build into your, you know, your Azure DevOps, or you may go and buy a completely new Hoover vacuum cleaner. There's me using, you know, products instead of the. We're getting confused on this.
I know. but to your point though, actually, just coming back to the GitHub analogy, GitHub piece with that and the analogy. The piece I would really see GitHub shining is the DevSecOps, and I know we're starting to add terms in there as well. Yeah. But think about things like Dependebot. Think about things like CodeQL. For anyone who doesn't know what they are, Dependebot is this nice little robot, effectively, that is looking in your repository at your packages and all of the things that you're depending on, and it will scan through and it will say, oh, you're using version 1.0.1 of Jonnychiph's great super package, but actually 1.0.2 has now been released. You need to go ahead and upgrade that. So rather than you needing to do all that boring maintenance overhead, where there could be, for example, security challenges, it will go ahead and point out and say, hey, I've just made a pull request to update that for you. Oh, and by the way, if you had GitHub Actions already set up, I've run those GitHub Actions for you and checked that everything still builds and compiles just fine for you. So you can go ahead and merge that without even checking it if you like. So it's that, and that, that idea of bringing security into that DevOps process, just like CodeQL and being able to alert on vulnerabilities. I think other platforms don't necessarily have some of that integration, and that's where I really see GitHub shining. And that's, again, personal opinion, but really a passion area for me around GitHub. I think it's some great standout features there.
No, and again, it's great insights, I guess, Chris, because, from the perspective of, when you're starting to learn all these new technologies for the first time, and you come across these things like with either GitHub Actions or building or creating build pipelines, you can bring in these little add-ins and plugins, essentially, that are third-party written, that do a lot of the heavy lifting for you as an infra guy or an ops guy or a dev guy, that can kind of just plug into whatever it is that you're doing and do all of these checks, like you say, DevSecOps, so building that security in and bringing that security a lot closer to where you're doing the development work. And that's the intention, Chris. From my perspective, this is where, as soon as you scratch that surface on a technology, all of a sudden it's like Alice in Wonderland. You go into this magical world of possibilities, and all of a sudden, you may be that DBA that hasn't got a clue at the moment what Git is. But believe me, if you're of that type where, and I think it's fair to say you probably do need that inquisitive nature, and
absolutely.
It probably comes with a lot of people that work in IT generally are those types. But of course, if you're not, that's fair enough. But for me personally, just being able to scratch that surface and then dig a little deeper and deeper again, sometimes you end up in rabbit holes chasing your own tail, but you learn from that. I guess I'm guessing that's probably how you've learnt it, Chris, and it's certainly how I'm learning it at the moment, is literally jumping in, having a play, creating some stuff, using MS Learn to kind of guide you through this whole meandering process. But then once you take a step back, and I guess this is why I thought I'd set up this series of videos, is to kind of help people into that journey of learning and learning about these new technologies. I appreciate they've been around for a little while, but certainly to a lot of people they're new. And that's brilliant insights, Chris. In terms of your view on where GitHub is going versus Azure DevOps at the moment. Are there any other things that the kind of you can do with Git at the moment? Because I've noticed, and I've seen you blog about things like using sort of static content pages and Hugo. Are there any other little kind of quick wins maybe you might want to point people at to get them to dip their toes in, so to speak? Yeah,
sure. I think that is a really good one, actually, the static content side of things. Being able to set up a super cheap, super quick and easy website is a really nice way of going. Storing infrastructure as code there, because the nice thing, if you're an infrastructure person or operations person thinking about this, is if you could lock down a repository so that any changes have to be reviewed by someone else before they're committed. Just think about that now actually you've always got a kind of compliance area where your infrastructure is defined. So you can start getting rid of some of those snowflake systems and actually start getting into this world where you start deploying just, version controlled systems effectively, and change those actually in your version control. So I think that's another nice area. Also, on the infrastructure side, think about all of those PowerShell scripts you've probably run to maintain things. And you've got version 1, version 1.0 final 2. We've all been there. It gets a bit confusing to track that. And when you've got to share that with colleagues, and you've got to kind of onboard them onto the scripts and the processes that you've been running, that gets a bit confusing. So if you can just have this nice repository where you've got all of that laid out and you can see all the history of changes and why those changes have taken place as well, it really helps with that onboarding experience then, and that kind of shared team dynamic then as well, I would say. So those would be a few quick wins from my perspective, I think.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks for that, Chris. I'm sure, if you're watching this now, go and take a look. Go and dip into Git. Go and take a look at static content. As Chris has alluded to there, there's some great things you can do with that, and it's free. It's not like you're having to shell out a lot of money to do these things. So, Chris, that's been fantastic. I'm looking. I mean, whether or not we can change our track a little bit now, and let's focus a bit on you, because I know before we started the recording, but you're changing your role. You're doing a huge amount with community at the moment, so you've got a user group that you're co-organising as well. Should we change track a little bit and just tell us about this new and exciting role that you're moving into with Microsoft?
Yeah, sure.
As much as you can tell us, of course, and maybe what's driven you to change role from a fast track engineer, and take us through that journey, Chris. That'd be great to hear.
Sure, yeah. So I guess starting with the previous role a sec, I've been in this role for about 4 years now, and I was kind of team member, I think number 8 or number 9 globally, first outside of the US, and we're now, many hundreds of people in that organization. So it's been quite a journey over the past 4 years. And for me, like anyone, you kind of look at your career, what is it you want to do? What do you want to do next? And for me, there was a couple of things. Number one is really focusing on the community, being able to do the YouTubing, the vlogging, the blogging, the user groups, the meetups, etc. But number two is getting some really deep relationships with customers again, and really focusing on that partnership side of things. And in the Fast Track team, where we're project-based, you kind of see a project, see it to completion, and then you're gone, and that's kind of the relationship over. And I want a bit more than that. I want a bit longer. So that's where I'm going to be moving into a cloud solution architect role inside of Microsoft. So still using the same skill sets, still focusing on app dev and everything that we've been talking about, but more relationship focused, and gives me the scope to focus on the community side of things as well. So I'm going to be working with a particular industry, manufacturing, and resources. So it's going to be quite interesting. I've already been thinking of some of the technologies that might come up, like IoT, and particularly DevOps as well. Over the last week, we've seen some interesting things around the supply chain. And, when you think about manufacturing, that's all about supply chain, right? So I think there's going to be some interesting areas to focus in on from a technology perspective there. So really looking forward to marrying up some of the broader discussions that I've had in the past around technology, focusing on a particular industry and going particularly deep there. So it's going to be a bit of fun.
That's great to hear, Chris, and obviously I wish you all the very best for that. But I mean, it's interesting you say that you're moving into the manufacturing realm, because of course DevOps plays brilliantly well into manufacturing with its sort of roots in Japanese sort of I think it was Toyota introduced the lean manufacturing and the lean principles that kind of blew through manufacturing as various different initiatives. I think you had things like Kaizen and 5S's and all of these great initiatives. So I think, that'll be, I guess, a brilliant place to be, like you say, marrying up those skill sets that you've had over the last few years working in that Fast Track team, and then actually entering the kind of manufacturing vertical and taking that on to showing how you can do some great things. I love it how you mentioned IoT there, because it's an area close to my heart at the moment. It's certainly an area that I'm having a play about with. So I mean, obviously we'll keep in touch, no doubt, and I look forward to seeing some of the great stuff you're working on there. No, that's great, and good luck with that, Chris. I mean, in terms of the other things you've got going on at the moment, you've like I say, we'll put all the links to your blog, to your vlog, and your website in the link below. But I mean, in terms of user group and the community focus that you've got going on at the moment, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've got going on there?
Sure, yeah. And if we switch over to the screen just for a bit of a visual as well.
Yeah, sure.
So Azure Thames Valley is a group that has been around for, I think, a couple of years, but they've had a couple of false starts with it. They did try, I think, last year to do something with it, but obviously the world changed a little bit over the last year, which meant a little bit of a struggle to kind of get started there. So I reached out to the folks who were running it just before Christmas and was saying how I was interested in starting a group, spotted they were already there, so would it be worth pairing up and joining forces and actually getting this going again? And here we are a few months later, starting to get our first session on February the 17th. So it's going to be quite exciting. We've got actually our first few sessions scheduled, so February the 17th and March the 16th. focused on Azure storage or security and compliance. And really, we're a local user group for the kind of Thames Valley area. So if you're listening from the Reading, Maidenhead, Bracknell, that kind of area, Thames Valley, you're very welcome. And of course, while we're remote as well, you're very welcome, because anyone could go and join those sessions as well. And I must say, by the way, as well, we're taking a lot of inspiration from yourselves in the Welsh Azure user group. So you're doing some great stuff there with Fab February, I think it was you were calling it as
That's
well, right?
Yeah. But well, actually, what I'll point out is obviously this is going out on Friday. So it's going out on Friday, which will be as I quickly check the calendar, the 19th. So
cool.
Your session is 2 days prior to this. So
time travel.
Have you got exactly? We're going back in time. Are you recording the sessions, Chris? Are you going to put them up onto
yes.
YouTube? Yep.
Yep, so we're going to put them on the Cloud with Chris channel, I think is the intent. So how quickly we'll do that, I don't know. Obviously, we don't want to put them up too quickly so people don't join the session and have that interactivity as well. So again, it's more getting into the rhythm of things for us as a committee and just understanding how we want to run things. So we're still kind of feeling our feet a bit, but absolutely we'll be recording,
Yeah, how are you finding it so far, Chris? It's it's from my experience, it's a great thing to be involved with a bunch of like-minded people. Are you finding it the same?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. And I mean, I've done community stuff before, not in technology though. As you might be able to peek behind me, I've got a few musical theatre posters up on the walls. So I do a bit of amateur dramatics as well, and I've done committee work for that in the past as well. And it's really rewarding, right? Being able to work in the community, being able to help others. And, there's no expectation on anyone to kind of give anything. You just want to be able to give back, because I've been able to be successful and get where I am, and I want to be able to help other people out and grow and learn as well. And, it's an area that I'm passionate about, and hopefully can give back. And that's all there is to it, really. And
definitely, I couldn't agree more. I think it's just it's a great use of time. I know we're all in lockdown still at the moment, and who knows how things change when we're able to get back out and mix a little bit more than we are at the moment. Personally, I'm hoping not from a virtual perspective. I think it's just been such a fantastic thing to be able to set up, and like you say, the reach. We've got these like localized user groups, and for me at the moment, I'm looking for physical people in the vicinity to kind of join, so that when we do get back to face, not that we want to stop the virtual, because I think it's just such a great source of information, social. We put prizes on. I'm guessing you guys are going to be doing the same with the Azure Thames Valley user group.
I'm sure.
It's such a great. So, you're on Twitter. You've got Azure Thames is your Twitter handle, isn't it? But again, you'll send me through a list of links after this session there, Chris, and I'll make sure they're up on the website, so people can find that and join, and obviously watch the replay of the session from Wednesday if you're watching us now on Friday, of course.
Absolutely.
That's great, Chris. In terms of where you're going with that at the moment, you said you're finding your feet. You're throwing around a few ideas, no doubt, at the minute. Do you want to let us know who you've got coming up in the sessions you've got organised at the moment?
Yeah, so we've got Matthew Bradley, we've got Alan Erdley as well coming up. And then I've been chatting with a few people already, like Sarah Lean, for example. I've been chatting with Christos Matskas. I found it quite funny, actually, when I saw Christos popping up on the Welsh Azure User Group, because I know Christos really well. We actually worked on the same team way back when. So, he's a good guy. So we've got Christos coming, and one of the aims I have is to kind of have a roll up to Christmas, like a nice kind of seasonal, festive type extravaganza type thing. I've got no idea what it is. It's literally something I've just started toying together. So we'll see what comes of that. But stay tuned is all I can say.
It's good fun though, isn't it? Just being able to kind of, some of the ideas we throw around within the group there, and I suppose it's the same with the Azure-ish guys as well. Some of the ideas, they may be a little bit outlandish, but hey ho, let's go for it.
Try, right?
The more fun, the better is my motto. Just get involved and do a bit. And I suppose that's just kind of touch on the social sides of things at the moment, Chris, in terms of when you put back the community. What would your kind of message be to anybody in the industry at the moment that maybe is watching this video? Maybe they're following a few people on Twitter. what's it been like for you, that bit, that giving back to community? Has it helped you? Has it hindered you? What's your take on that, Chris?
I think it's just really rewarding, right? And I think when we think about some of the this is going to get very extra now, but I think when you think about some of the challenges in the world right now, with some of the unrest we're seeing, etc., to come together as a community right now is really important. And if we've all got shared interests around technology, why not let's start there? Why not let's start building up a community around that, trying to help out each other? For me, really enjoyed it, being able to start meeting people locally that I wouldn't have, virtually, of course, but I wouldn't have started meeting otherwise. And just really enjoying mixing with new people because, like we said about imposter syndrome earlier, I don't know everything, but what I can do is learn from others and their experiences, because the more you speak to other people, the more experiences you learn. And I think, coming to your point, by the way, about kind of the remote way of working, one of the things that we've already said is we still want to keep some kind of remote session in Azure Thames Valley, mainly for the inclusivity side of things, because, if in my new role, for example, I have to travel away for a day, I can't be there on that once a month meetup. I don't get to involve with that community or interact with that community. Mm-hmm. That's kind of not letting me be part of that almost, and swaying me away a little bit. So I think it's also opened up this idea that actually we can still all be together in a slightly different way, of course, but it just brings that inclusivity with everyone as well. I think I've made up a word there.
No, I think I've got you, Chris, and I think you bang on, because I think traditionally I've always tried where I can to attend these face-to-face meetups, and they've been fantastic. And the best part, of course, is you get to see great speakers, but then you have a pint of beer, some pizza afterwards, and a general natter with like-minded people, and there's such a fun thing to do, even if it's just for a social engagement. And
exactly.
I think one of the things I alluded to earlier in terms of getting people to come along, albeit at the moment virtually and hopefully face-to-face if and when we get back to that point. But I think the message I'd like to throw out there as we're speaking about community is, if you're watching this and you work with a bunch of people, if you live around Thames Valley, if you live around South Wales or Glasgow, or if you're up north, there is so many community user groups now springing up, and,
yes.
and go and reach out to them. Seriously, if you've not done any social interaction before, which, let's face it, as techie, I guess generally we're all a little bit introverted in certain ways. I guess you're not, Chris, coming from an Amdram background, but
you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised, honestly. No.
Yeah. But that's the point, isn't it? I think is the fact that there's so much to gain from it. And I think it's great when we're on Twitter. We've got this fantastic community of folk that kind of have got the community bug. They're interacting. We're interacting. They're replying back. We're having a little bit of banter. It's all good fun. But what in the back of my mind, I'm trying to reach those people that maybe aren't watching this video now. Maybe they are, quite rightly sat at home with their family, having a bit of tea, watching a bit of TV or whatever, and have switched off for the day, which absolutely is a good place to be as well, because let's face it, we can all go a little bit over the top with everything at times.
Yes. Yeah.
How do we reach out to those people that maybe haven't realized yet what this community thing is all about, or what source of information is out? Have you given that any thought, Chris, and do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question, because I think I've been wondering the same, how we grow Azure Thames Valley, how I make people aware of Cloud with Chris. And I think the only thing that I can think of so far is just the kind of organic way of getting everyone to help each other out, right? You've got followers, I've got followers, we kind of share out and retweet and whatnot. And eventually people will start picking up on that and seeing, this is interesting. I follow John. He puts out good stuff. Maybe this guy's good to follow as well. And you kind of have that network of connections. Because if you think about it from the day job, the important thing that people probably tell you all the time is about the networking and the importance of tapping into that network, right? And I think it's a similar idea here, that the more people the more you see these things kind of bubbling up in your Facebook feed, your Twitter, your LinkedIn, that might start spiking up a little bit of interest there. So I think that's probably the first way that we all can start, is just helping each other out a little bit there. I know you and I do, for example, a lot there. But
I mean, it's great. It's great to see when I see the stuff that you're putting out there. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, but it's fantastic content, and I think. I've said it on previous shows. Up until a point, I'm going back 10 years ago. There wasn't many places to get your knowledge. It was kind of Channel 9 videos. There were previous sort of tech conference events that you maybe have a list of sessions that you can watch and rewatch.
Yep.
Community content was there. It probably wasn't as in your face as it has been now over the last few months, but. What I like to try and roll back on is when I share a post or put something out there, is not so much about look at me, I'm doing something silly with a robot arm or this, that, and the other. But it's trying to spark that interest in somebody to go, let me click on that, and then they click on my link and see, oh, hang on a second, there's this whole community of stuff here that I didn't realise was there. Thank you for hooking me in. And like you said earlier, sometimes it sounds a little bit cliche when you say these things, but look, I think. If you are watching this and you've managed to get to another hour of conversation, kudos, thank you so much, because I know sometimes these videos may not get watched as much as they probably should be, but I think it's just spread the word. So spread the word about Azure Thames Valley, about the Welsh user group, and all the other user groups that we've got around the UK and globally. I guess, Chris, there's so much great content, isn't there?
Absolutely, and I think there was a point that you mentioned in there as well around. I've completely blanked now. Got all the way to the end. I do that all the time. Got all the way to the end, and my mind has gone blank. Never mind. I'm sure. I
normally rabbit so much that I make everybody forget what they were going to say. No. I mean, honestly, Chris, it's been fantastic to have you on as a guest. I mean, it's great catching up with you. I know we've been virtually chatting over the last few months or so, but. I mean, keep up the fantastic work that you've got going on with Cloud with Chris. Like I say, all the links, everything me and Chris have been discussing now tonight, we'll make sure they're in the link below. So if you give that a click, you'll see a plethora of links. Of course, Chris, you're going to send a lot of those over to me now. I mean, is there any other parting comments you'd like to, before we wrap up this conversation, Chris? Is there anything... Or is your mind gone completely blank?
I was going to say, I'm desperately trying to think what I was going to say, but my brain has completely gone fried. No, I think we've talked about a few areas there. I think ultimately, if you want to get started, there's no time better to get started. I've just remembered what it is, and I can link it in now, which is. You mentioned about, there's this big community, and I think there's something I've been wondering about, which is some blog posts that I'm going to write. And just to give a quick analogy as we wrap up, there have been some people that have been talking about content around like GPG keys, being able to use YubiKeys and all these things. And it's not my area of expertise at all. I'm not depthy in it at all. But trying to understand and pull together some of this content has had me kind of pulling my hair out a little bit in stages. And, I've been looking at various blog posts, and there we go. I've got mine in my hard drive right now. But there's loads of different content out there, but nothing that quite strung it together in the story that I wanted to get through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a series of blog posts around that, but link back to all of the posts that I use to help me get there as well. Yeah, so I think, again, if you're someone who's thinking, there's all these great people in the community, John's putting out great content, these people are putting out great content, I can't put something out there, I have nothing to say. Just get started. It's building stuff, and you'll probably start finding along the way, actually, I have got things to tell. And that's at least how I find my blog posts starting to come out. And some of my videos is just by the things I start doing. And like you said earlier, it's not showing off. It's just a case of, hey, I encountered this problem. These posts didn't quite figure it out for me because of ABC. So I'm just going to use these and string the story along in a way that makes sense for the scenario I had. And ultimately, why not then start contributing from then on and catch the bug?
Absolutely, Chris. And that's a fantastic way to wrap it up, actually, because it echoes previous guests' comments on blogging and YouTube videos and putting content out there, is that it's great to have that single vision on a particular problem or a task, but being able to kind of go from the start of a problem, hopping through, like you say. It may be other blog posts, it may be YouTube videos. That'd be a fantastic way to do it, Chris. I'm looking forward to when you're doing some of that. And I think that's how I see things as well. It's not so much about learning a particular technology, but being able to apply it and apply it in a way that makes sense and solves a particular problem. And like I say, previous guests, Gregor mentioned it, and I think he's actually put a call out to Microsoft directly around, it would be great to see that kind of content where, yes, it's around architectural patterns, and yes, it's around technical capabilities, but what can we actually do? Stringing all of these new fandangled acronyms and three-letter things together that formulate this entire journey. So brilliant point to end on, I think, Chris.
Excellent.
So on that note, all I can say is thanks so much for joining me tonight, Chris, as a guest. It's been fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed our chat. And yeah, all your links, all your blog posts, your website, the Cloud with Chris website, your Twitter handle, they'll all be below. So everybody that's watching, go and give Chris a quick like and a follow. Obviously, subscribe to his YouTube for some great content in the coming months as well. So on that note, thanks so much for being a great guest, Chris.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great show and all the great content you put out as well, John. It's really great to see the journey we're both on. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. And no doubt we'll catch up in a few months and we'll see how you're getting on with a new role. So good luck with that as well, Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you.